The Duke's mother slapped her at the ball, then someone shouted, "How dare you touch the Duchess?" Every corner of the ballroom seemed alive, whispers of silk gowns brushing marble floors, the gentle clinking of glasses, the soft hum of a string quartet echoing like a delicate wind. It was midsummer, a night of celebration, of alliances, and some would say of secrets. Lady Alara entered the ballroom quietly, though not unnoticed. She was dressed in a deep sapphire gown that flowed like liquid night around her ankles. Her hair was pinned high, yet strands of dark waves framed her face, giving her an air of effortless grace. But more than her beauty, there was something about her that drew attention, an aura of mystery, a presence that seemed to demand notice even when she wished for none. She moved through the crowd with careful poise, avoiding too many eyes, though she could feel whispers following her like shadows. Tonight was not a night for simple entertainment. Alara had come with a purpose. There were rumors in the courts, rumors of unrest, of schemes that could topple kingdoms if left unchecked. She needed allies, and she needed to be seen. That was why she had braved the presence of the Duke's family, who were known for their rigid etiquette and sharp tongues. The Duke of Aramont, Corvin, was already present, standing near the high dais with his mother, Duchess Marceline, and a cluster of nobles. Corvin was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed almost too large for the delicate tailoring of his evening coat. His face, handsome yet severe, held an intensity that kept many at a respectful distance. Dark eyes, almost black, scanned the room like a hawk, and though his expression was calm, there was a storm hidden beneath the surface, a storm that few had dared to approach. Alara felt it. Even from across the room she sensed the weight of his gaze. She knew of the stories, how the Duke carried a darkness within him, a shadow that seemed to feed on anger and pride. Most fled from such men, fearing what they could not understand. But Alara, for reasons she could not yet name, felt drawn instead of repelled. As she moved closer, she passed the Duchess, a woman of porcelain beauty and delicate composure. Marceline's eyes were soft but guarded, as if she carried the weight of 1,000 secrets behind her calm smile. Alara, intending only to offer a polite nod of greeting, let her hand brush against the Duchess's sleeve. It was a brief touch, a gesture of courtesy. But in the world of Aramont, even such a small gesture could carry consequences. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the music. Gasps filled the air, and every eye in the hall turned toward the Duchess's mother-in-law. The Duke's mother, tall and imposing with silver hair swept into a regal bun, had stepped forward and slapped Alara across the face. The sound echoed like a crack of thunder, silencing the ballroom for a heartbeat. Alara staggered slightly, shock and humiliation coiling together like a living thing. Her cheek burned, not only from the sting of the blow but from the eyes of the gathered nobles, all watching, all judging. She had faced danger before, even death, but never a moment so sharp, so raw in its humiliation. And then came the voice. "How dare you touch the Duchess?" It shouted, cutting through the tension like a blade. The hall seemed to freeze. All attention now fell on the source of the voice, a figure stepping from the shadows near the dais. No one recognized immediately who it was, but the words carried authority, a note of fire that left no room for argument. And still, all Alara could feel was the gaze of Duke Corvin upon her. It was not anger, not exactly, though there was a flicker of that beneath his composed exterior. No, it was something else, curiosity, recognition, a dangerous spark that made her pulse quicken despite the humiliation. She could not look away, and she did not try. The Duke's mother, sensing perhaps that she had lost control of the situation, drew back slightly, her eyes narrowing. Yet even she could not command the storm brewing in her son's dark gaze. Corvin stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his long coat brushing the polished marble. The room seemed to hold its breath, every whisper silenced by the presence of a man who had the power to command silence with mere intent. "Lady Alara," he said, his voice low, smooth, yet carrying a weight that made her stomach tighten. "You have made quite the entrance." There was no anger in the words, only a dangerous calm, the kind that could shift to fury in a heartbeat. Alara straightened, though her cheek still throbbed. She kept her chin high, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I apologize if I have caused offense," she said softly, the elegance of her speech masking the storm of emotions within her. Pride, embarrassment, curiosity, all jostled for dominance. Corvin's eyes lingered on her, searching, as though trying to decipher a puzzle that no one else could even see. "Offense is one thing," he said, stepping closer, "but recklessness is another." His tone suggested warning, perhaps even threat, yet it was tempered with a fascination that made her pulse race. The ballroom murmurs began again, softer now, but still insistent. Guests whispered about the incident, about the Duke's sudden attention on a newcomer, about the audacity of a young woman daring to enter their world unshielded. Yet amid all the gossip, Alara felt the unmistakable pull of Corvin's presence. She was aware of the danger she faced, not only from him but from his mother, the whispers, the social currents of the palace. And yet, she could not turn away. The Duke's mother, sensing perhaps that her son might be tempted by intrigue she could not control, raised her hand. "Corvin," she said, her voice sharp as ice, "this is not the time to encourage scandal. Remove her from our sight." For a moment, Corvin's gaze flickered, a shadow of conflict crossing his otherwise impassive face. He turned slowly toward his mother, his posture stiff with authority restrained. "Mother," he said softly, "do not mistake caution for cowardice." There was a note in his voice, a quiet command that told the room. This matter was no longer hers to decide. Alara, standing there, felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had not expected anyone to protect her, not here, not in this palace of power and whispers. And yet, the Duke's attention was not only protection. It was a promise, unspoken but powerful. A promise of reckoning, of recognition, of something dangerous and thrilling. As the Duke took another step toward her, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lean closer, as if curious to see what would unfold. The string quartet continued playing, though the melody now felt almost secondary to the electric tension in the air. Every noble present could feel it, the storm building between the Duke and the mysterious newcomer. Alara's mind raced. She could feel the eyes of the Duchess, of the courtiers, of the entire ballroom upon her. Every step she had taken, every word she had spoken, had brought her here, to this moment where danger and fascination coiled together like twin serpents. She knew the consequences of misstep. One wrong word, one wrong glance, and her life in this palace could crumble. Yet she could not deny the strange pull toward the Duke. There was a loneliness in his eyes that mirrored her own, a shadow of sorrow and rage that she recognized because she carried shadows of her own. For a moment, she imagined speaking to him freely, revealing the truth of her purpose, her fears, her hidden past. But the moment passed, and the walls of etiquette and duty pressed back around them. "Step lightly here, Lady Alara," the Duke murmured, voice low enough that only she could hear, "for this palace is full of eyes and not all of them are friendly." Her pulse quickened. There was warning there, yes, but also something more, a recognition of strength, a challenge issued quietly, secretly, to her very spirit. And for reasons she did not yet understand, she accepted it. The Duke's mother, sensing the tide had shifted, withdrew with a flick of her gown, her lips pressed into a thin line. The ball continued, though its warmth had cooled. Whispers now carried caution, curiosity, and intrigue. And in the midst of it all, Alara and Corvin remained two figures locked in a silent battle of presence, a dance of restraint and longing that neither dared fully name. As the night pressed on, the Duke finally stepped back, his dark eyes still following her. "Be careful," he said quietly, and for a moment the ballroom seemed to fade. Only the two of them existed in that fragile bubble, separated from the courtly world but bound by unspoken tension. Alara felt the weight of his words, their meaning layered with threat, fascination, and perhaps even a strange kind of invitation. The night was young, but already she knew that her life in Aramont Palace had changed forever. The shadows were watching. The whispers would not end, and the Duke, dangerous, lonely, powerful, had noticed her. The moment lingered, a breath held between heartbeats. And in that silence, as chandeliers glimmered above and the ballroom swirled with music and light, Alara realized something terrifyingly beautiful. She was no longer just a guest in the palace. She had entered a world of power, danger, and desire, and she was not sure if she would survive it unscathed. But deep within, a spark of something wild, something daring, ignited. And she knew she would not turn away. The music of the ballroom faded into a distant hum as Lady Alara walked along the marble corridors of Aramont Palace. Her cheek still tingled from the Duke's mother's sharp hand, and the whispers of the nobles seemed to follow her like shadows. Every step echoed lightly in the vast halls, and yet, despite the sting of humiliation, a strange thrill lingered in her chest. She could not shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn into something darker, something dangerously fascinating. The palace garden stretched beyond the western wing, a secret place of solace and whispered confidences. Moonlight poured over the black roses and silver-leaf trees, casting long shadows that danced like silent specters. Here, far from the gaze of the court, the world seemed quieter, more forgiving. And yet, even here, Alara felt a sense of watchful eyes, as if the night itself were waiting for her. She had intended to remain alone, to gather her thoughts and calm the racing of her heart. But she did not expect to find the Duke waiting, his dark figure framed against the moonlight, tall and unyielding. Corvin stepped forward as she approached, his movements measured and deliberate. There was no announcement of his presence. He simply appeared, as though the shadows themselves had formed into a man. His black coat brushed the tops of the silvered grass, and the faint scent of the night, cool and damp, touched with the scent of roses, mingled with the faint fragrance of his cologne. "Lady Alara," he said, his voice low, smooth, yet edged with something unspoken. "You should not wander the gardens alone. It is unwise." Alara met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the nervous flutter in her chest. "And yet," she replied softly, "here you are, warning me. Are you not the one who commands caution in every corner of this palace?" Corvin's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, as though amused by her courage. "I command many things," he said, "but not fear of the shadows that lurk in the night. That is your choice." There was silence between them, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a night bird. Alara could feel the weight of his gaze upon her, like an invisible tether that pulled at her very spirit. It was thrilling and terrifying at once, a dangerous promise hidden behind calm words. "I did not mean to offend anyone at the ball," Alara said after a moment, her voice quieter now. "It was a mistake." Corvin's eyes darkened, and the wind seemed to stir around them, brushing against her hair and sending a shiver down her spine. "Mistakes are rarely so simple," he said, stepping closer. "Some can follow a person like a shadow, growing larger, heavier, until they cannot escape it." Alara felt a chill at his words, though she was unsure if it was the night air or the intensity of his presence. She realized that the Duke of Aramont was not merely a man. He was a force, a storm wrapped in human form, and she had stepped directly into its path. "Why are you speaking to me?" she asked, searching his expression. "Why not leave me to the courtiers, to the whispers, to your mother?" For a moment, Corvin's eyes softened, revealing a flicker of something human beneath the stoic mask. "Because," he said quietly, "you are different. I can feel it. Unlike the others, you do not bend easily. You do not fear shadows that others would flee from, and that is dangerous for both of us." Alara's pulse quickened at his words. There was danger here, yes, but there was also an unspoken connection, a recognition of loneliness and strength that both of them carried in secret. She had faced storms before, but none like this, none that made her heart race while warning her to run. "I do not fear," she said softly, though even she could feel the tremor of uncertainty beneath her words. "I only seek understanding." Corvin's dark eyes studied her, as though weighing her soul against some invisible measure. "Understanding comes at a cost," he said finally, "and the price in this palace is often higher than one is willing to pay." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of roses and night-blooming jasmine, and the shadows of the trees seemed to lean closer as though listening. Alara took a cautious step forward, drawn inexplicably toward him, and he did not move back. There was an unspoken agreement forming, fragile and dangerous, like a thread stretched over a void. For the first time, she noticed something unusual about the Duke, a darkness that lingered at the edges of his presence, almost like a living shadow. It moved with him, curling and stretching as though it had a will of its own. She shivered, unsure whether to be afraid or fascinated. "What is that?" she whispered, nodding subtly toward the darkness that clung to him. Corvin's lips pressed into a thin line. "A shadow," he said simply, though there was no simplicity in his tone. "One that I have carried for many years. It feeds on anger, on fear, on resentment, and it does not forgive easily." Alara's mind raced. She had heard whispers in the courts of the Duke's temper, of his ruthlessness and the strange events that followed him. But she had never imagined something so alive, so aware, so intimately bound to him. "Can it hurt you?" she asked carefully, her instincts wary. "It has," he admitted, "many times, and it will again if I am not careful. That is why I keep it hidden from those who cannot see its truth." Alara considered this, her mind turning over possibilities. She realized that she had stumbled into a world where power was not only political but also supernatural, where danger could take forms unseen. And yet, despite the threat, she felt herself drawn closer, as though the shadow itself could not frighten her away. "Then why are you here with me?" she asked softly. "Knowing the risk." Corvin's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment the night seemed still. "Because," he said quietly, "I see strength in you, a light that even the shadows cannot touch. And because I am lonely in ways that words cannot reach." Alara's heart ached at his words. There was a loneliness in his voice that mirrored her own, a weight carried silently, like armor that could not be removed. She understood, perhaps more than she wanted to admit, the burden of hiding one's true self behind masks, behind etiquette, behind fear. "You are not as alone as you think," she said finally, taking a careful step closer. "There are those who see, those who understand." Corvin's lips twitched into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but understanding does not always save one from the consequences of power, of legacy, of shadows." For a long moment they stood in silence, the garden around them quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. The tension between them was palpable, electric, a thread pulled tight with longing and fear. Then, without warning, a sound shattered the fragile calm, the distant echo of a servant's hurried footsteps, and the faint but unmistakable voice of the Duke's mother, calling for her son. Corvin's expression hardened instantly, and the shadows around him seemed to stir with renewed life. Alara felt a pang of disappointment. The moment, fragile and rare, was slipping away. Yet she understood instinctively that their conversation could not continue in full view of the palace. Corvin stepped closer, his dark eyes locking on hers, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "Be careful, Lady Alara," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Not all who watch are as merciful as I might be, and some shadows do not wait for permission to strike." Alara nodded, her chest tight with a mix of fear and exhilaration. "I will remember," she said softly. "And I will be cautious." Corvin's gaze lingered a moment longer, heavy with meaning, before he turned and walked away, the shadows trailing behind him like living things. Alara watched him go, feeling both the ache of distance and the strange warmth of connection. She understood now that the Duke's attention was both a gift and a danger, a force that could elevate her or destroy her, depending on how she navigated the treacherous waters of his world. She remained in the garden long after he had gone, letting the cool night air wash over her. Her mind replayed their conversation over and over, each word weighted with unspoken promises, warnings, and desire. She understood now that life in Aramont Palace would never be simple again. Every step she took, every word she spoke would carry consequence. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a spark, a daring, unrelenting spark that refused to be extinguished. She was drawn into the world of shadows, of power, of a man whose presence could command silence and stir storms within her. As the moon rose higher in the sky, Alara finally turned back toward the palace. The ball continued inside, oblivious to the silent tensions of the garden. Yet she knew with an unshakable certainty that the night had changed everything. The Duke had noticed her, the shadows had moved, and the game of power, desire, and danger had begun. Her pulse quickened at the thought. She was no longer merely a guest. She was a participant in a world of intrigue, a world that would demand courage, cunning, and a heart brave enough to face shadows. And she would face them, not alone, and not without the dangerous, magnetic presence of the Duke of Aramont guiding her path, whether she wished it or not. The palace felt different in the early hours of the morning, when most of its residents slept, and only the soft whispers of the wind traveled through marble halls. Lady Alara moved carefully through the corridors, her footsteps muted by the thick carpets. Though the ball had ended hours ago, its echoes lingered in her mind, the laughter, the music, the sting of the Duke's mother's hand. But above all, she could not shake the memory of Duke Corvin's gaze, dark and intense, following her even after the confrontation. She had thought the garden had been a private refuge, a place to gather her thoughts. Yet the Duke's words echoed in her mind. Not all who watch are as merciful as I might be, and some shadows do not wait for permission to strike. Alara had always known that the world of nobles was a treacherous one, filled with rules and subtle threats, but Aramont Palace carried its own dangers, secrets that stretched back for generations, and shadows that were not merely metaphorical. Her curiosity, once a quiet trait, now drove her forward. She wanted answers, and if the palace itself would not speak them, she would find a place that could. The abandoned wing of Aramont Palace was a place few dared to enter. Long ago, it had housed members of the royal family who had fallen out of favor, their rooms now draped in dust, faded tapestries, and cobwebs that shimmered like silver threads in the faint moonlight. Here, history seemed to breathe from every corner, heavy and secretive, and Alara felt its weight immediately. She stepped into one of the old chambers, a library of sorts, though most of its books had fallen to ruin. Broken shelves leaned against walls, and old portraits of nobles long dead stared down with hollow eyes. Alara traced her fingers over the spine of a tattered book and paused when a single parchment fell free. It was a letter, yellowed with age, written in elegant script. The words were careful, but their meaning was unmistakable, a warning of a curse that had plagued the family of the Duke of Aramont for generations. According to the parchment, any woman whom the Duke's mother despised or publicly shamed would be at risk of ruin unless the Duke willingly protected her, defying the expectations of the court. Alara's heart quickened. She realized immediately that the slap at the ball was not merely a mark of anger or pride. It was part of a pattern, a centuries-old chain of influence, tied to a curse she did not fully understand. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the final lines. Only courage, only trust, only the bond of truth can break the chain that binds the innocent to the shadow. Beware the whispers of the past, for they will seek to control the present. Alara tucked the letter into her gown and pressed her palm to her chest, feeling a mix of fear and determination. This curse, hidden beneath layers of etiquette and power, explained so much. The stories whispered in the corridors, the dark rumors of the Duke's temper and shadow, the strict control of his mother. And it explained her own dangerous fascination with Corvin. She realized she needed answers, not just from books, but from the man himself. And yet, approaching him would be as dangerous as stepping into fire. The next evening, she found her chance. The ballroom had been quiet all day, the nobles distracted by court duties, and the Duke was walking alone along a terrace overlooking the palace gardens. The moonlight bathed him in silver, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of him. Alara approached cautiously. "Duke Corvin," she called softly, and he turned, dark eyes narrowing in recognition. "Lady Alara," he said, voice low and cautious. "It is late. You should not wander alone." "I could say the same to you," she replied, her tone gentle but determined. "I need to ask you something important." Corvin's gaze studied her for a long moment, the shadows around him shifting with his emotion. Finally, he gestured toward a quieter part of the terrace. "Speak then, but be cautious. Words here are not free of consequence." Alara took a deep breath and held up the parchment she had discovered. "I found this," she said simply. "It speaks of a curse tied to your family, and to women who are disfavored by your mother." Corvin's expression darkened immediately. His fingers clenched at his sides and the shadows around him thickened. "You found the past," he said, his voice a low growl, "and the past does not forgive mistakes." "I need to understand it," she said, stepping closer. "Not just for me, but for you, for everyone in this palace who is trapped by fear and whispers. You do not have to face it alone." Corvin's gaze softened for just a moment, revealing the vulnerable man beneath the mask of the Duke. He sighed, a long and heavy sound as though the weight of centuries pressed down upon him. "Most would flee," he said, voice heavy with regret. "Most would run from the shadows that haunt me, but you do not." Alara felt her heart tighten. There was something raw and human in his admission, a truth he rarely shared. "I do not run from shadows," she said quietly. "I face them, and perhaps we can face them together." The Duke's eyes searched hers as though measuring the strength in her words. For a moment the shadows around him paused and the moonlight caught the edge of his dark hair, framing his face in silver. Then slowly he nodded. "Perhaps," he said, almost reluctantly. "But beware, Lady Alara. The shadows are patient, they wait, and they remember." She nodded, understanding more than he realized. "Then we will be patient too, and we will remember the truth, not the whispers." Corvin's hand hovered near hers for a moment, the shadowed air thick with tension and unspoken understanding. He did not take it, yet the closeness, the unspoken promise, was enough to ignite a spark neither could ignore. Suddenly, the air shifted. The shadows at the edge of the terrace twisted unnaturally, moving as though alive. Alara's heart skipped a beat. She had felt the Duke's shadow before in the garden, but now it moved with more purpose, as though aware of her presence, aware of her knowledge. "What is it?" she asked, voice low, though her pulse raced with both fear and fascination. Corvin's dark eyes narrowed. "A reminder," he said quietly. "The curse does not forgive mistakes easily. It knows who seeks to challenge it, and it will not hesitate to act." Alara's fingers brushed the parchment in her hand, feeling the weight of history pressing down upon her. "Then we must be careful," she said, "but we cannot hide, not if we are to change anything." Corvin studied her, the shadows around him twitching with unease. "You are braver than I thought," he said finally. "And perhaps that is what this palace, this curse, needs. Bravery that is not born of fear, but of conviction." Alara's heart lifted slightly, though it was heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. She had not expected to find trust here, in the corridors of power and shadow. Yet in Corvin, she sensed an ally, a partner, someone whose burdens mirrored her own in unexpected ways. For hours, they spoke quietly on the terrace, sharing fragments of truth, fragments of fear, and glimpses of hope. Corvin revealed more of the curse, how it had shaped his life, how it had turned allies into enemies, how it had isolated him from the world. Alara shared what she knew of her own strength, the subtle magic in her bloodline that could, perhaps, repel darkness. The conversation drew them closer, yet caution always lingered between them. They were not free to speak fully, not free to trust completely, but each word, each glance built a bridge over the shadows that separated them. As dawn approached, the first hints of light brushing the horizon, Alara felt a mixture of hope and dread. The curse, the shadows, the power struggles of the palace, all of it awaited them. But for the first time, she knew she was not entirely alone, and neither was Corvin. Suddenly, the faint echo of footsteps interrupted their fragile moment. Alara's heart lurched. She looked up to see a figure emerging from the shadows, the Duke's mother, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. The air seemed to thicken, the tension of centuries pressing down once more. "You are close," the Duke's mother said softly, almost a whisper, though the words carried the weight of command. "Too close. Some truths are not meant for the uninitiated." Corvin's shadow surged, a dark wave that rippled outward as he stepped protectively in front of Alara. "She has the right to know," he said, voice low but unyielding, "and you will not touch her." The Duke's mother's eyes narrowed. A storm of pride, power, and expectation radiated from her, and the shadows around her seemed to flicker in response. The tension between the three of them was a living thing, pulsing and dangerous. Alara's hand brushed the Duke's sleeve instinctively. She felt the warmth, the unspoken protection, and the promise of defiance. Even as fear gripped her, she understood one undeniable truth. She had stepped into a world of shadows, curses, and power struggles, and she would face it with him, willingly, despite the danger. And in that fragile, charged silence, she knew that the story of their lives, of the Duke, of the shadows, of the curse, was only beginning. The winter solstice had arrived, and the palace was alive with preparations for the festival. Snow fell softly outside, coating the gardens and terraces in a white silence. Candles flickered in every hall, casting golden light that danced across polished floors. Yet, despite the beauty, a tension hung over Aramont Palace like a storm cloud. Secrets, curses, and ambitions, old and new, were gathering strength, and Lady Alara knew the night would test everything she had learned about courage, trust, and love. She moved quietly through the corridors, her sapphire gown brushing the marble floor. The letter she had found, the warnings of the curse, the shadows she had seen lingering around Duke Corvin, all of it weighed on her. And yet, beneath the weight, there was determination. Tonight they would face the curse. Tonight they would confront the Duke's mother, the shadows, and the power that had haunted the palace for generations. Corvin waited in the throne room, his figure framed by the great windows that opened to the snow-covered terraces. The room was silent except for the faint hiss of the wind outside. His dark coat hung loosely around his shoulders, and the shadow that always clung to him seemed restless, coiling and stretching as if sensing the approaching confrontation. "Alara," he said softly as she approached, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the walls. "You should not be here. This night, it will demand everything of us." "I am not leaving," she replied firmly. "Not now, not ever. Whatever happens, I face it with you." He studied her, his dark eyes searching hers. For a moment the shadow around him seemed to pause, almost as if acknowledging her courage. "Then we begin," he said quietly, his voice heavy with both warning and relief. The Duke's mother entered the room at that moment, her presence commanding immediate attention. Her silver hair caught the light of the candles, and her sharp gaze swept over them both like a blade. "So," she said slowly, "you dare to defy tradition, defy power, and confront what should remain untouched." Corvin stepped forward, his shadow stretching wider across the floor. "I do not fear the past, mother," he said, voice steady, "and I will not allow harm to come to her." The Duke's mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "You still do not understand," she said, her tone both icy and sorrowful. "This curse is old, older than any living soul in this palace. It has shaped our family, our power, our very fate. To confront it is to challenge the foundation of all we have built." Alara stepped closer to Corvin, placing her hand lightly on his sleeve. "Then we challenge it together," she said, "not for defiance but for truth, for freedom from fear." The Duke's mother's eyes softened for just a moment, revealing the shadow of a past that few had seen. Then they hardened again. "Very well," she said, almost reluctantly. "But know this, the shadows obey not words alone. Only courage, only trust, and only the bond of hearts can change what has been set for centuries." Corvin turned to Alara, his hand brushing hers. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Alara nodded. "Yes, together." The shadows around Corvin stirred, coiling like living tendrils, and the room seemed to darken for a heartbeat. Then he reached out, taking her hand fully in his. The warmth of his touch spread through her, steadying her fear, grounding her determination. Together, they stepped into the center of the throne room. Corvin's shadow surged, filling the corners with darkness that seemed almost alive. Alara felt her own energy stir, a faint protective force in her bloodline responding to the danger. The room was charged, every candle flickering, every surface reflecting the tension. The Duke's mother watched silently, her expression unreadable. "Do what you must," she said, "but beware, shadows do not forgive weakness." Corvin closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then spoke words that were both command and incantation. The shadows around him shivered and shifted, their dark forms twisting toward Alara. She did not flinch. Instead, she focused inward, drawing on the subtle magic within her, the protective force that had guided her instincts since childhood. As their energies met, the room trembled. Shadows roared like wind through trees, curling around them, threatening to pull them apart. Yet they stood firm, hands clasped, hearts aligned. Corvin opened his eyes and the darkness responded to him, now controlled, now bending to his will, but not without effort. Alara felt a moment of fear, then determination surged. She reached out, speaking quietly not to the shadows but to the truth of their intentions. "We are not afraid. We are not enemies. We seek only freedom, trust, and understanding." The shadows hesitated. They writhed, resisting testing. Then slowly they began to recede, drawn back by the combined strength of courage and bond between the Duke and Alara. The air grew lighter, the room less oppressive, until at last, silence fell, complete, profound, and peaceful. Corvin lowered his hand, still holding hers, and breathed heavily. The shadows were subdued, no longer threatening. His eyes met Alara's, filled with awe and gratitude. You have more strength than I could have imagined," he said, voice soft, almost reverent. Alara smiled faintly, still feeling the aftershocks of the confrontation. "And you," she said, "have more heart than you let others see. That is why the shadows follow you, because they respect strength and fear only weakness." The Duke's mother stepped forward, her expression finally showing a trace of pride. "You have faced the curse together," she said slowly. Perhaps there is hope for our family yet." Corvin released Alara's hand, though his fingers lingered near hers. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for your courage, for your trust, for standing with me." Alara felt warmth spread through her chest. "I did not stand alone," she said softly. "We faced it together." The palace seemed to breathe again, the oppressive weight of centuries lifted, if only partially. Yet the shadows, though subdued, remained as a reminder. Danger and intrigue were never fully gone. But for now, the immediate threat had passed, and the bond between them had deepened, forged in both fear and triumph. Outside, snow continued to fall, silent and beautiful. Inside, the candles flickered gently, casting long, steady light. The Duke and Alara stood together, no longer strangers, no longer bound solely by caution or curiosity. They were allies, partners, and perhaps something more, a connection that transcended the shadows, the whispers, and the curse itself. For the first time, Corvin allowed himself to step closer, his hand brushing gently against hers, a silent acknowledgement of trust in something deeper, something unspoken. Alara felt her heart swell at the gesture, knowing that in this palace of power and secrets, she had found a safe place, if not free of danger, then one where courage and love could coexist. The Duke's mother watched them for a moment longer, then turned gracefully toward the doors of the throne room. Her gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, and she nodded once. "Go," she said quietly. "Face the future as you choose. I will not interfere, not tonight." Corvin exhaled slowly, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his posture. He turned fully to Alara, shadows at his back now calm, controlled. "Tonight we are free," he said softly, though both knew freedom in Aramont Palace was never complete. Free from the chains of past fear, free to live. Alara smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in days, yet still full of anticipation and courage. "And together," she added, letting her fingers brush against his hand once more, sealing the unspoken promise between them. The first light of dawn broke across the snow-covered terraces, painting the palace in silver and gold. Outside, the world was quiet, calm, and untouched by shadows. Inside, however, a new story had begun, a story of courage, trust, and the possibility of love in a place that had long been ruled by fear and whispers. And though the shadows remained, lurking at the edges of every corridor and hallway, they had been reminded. True courage, true trust, and a bond forged in honesty could bend even the darkest powers to their will. Corvin and Alara stood together, side by side, not merely as duke and visitor, not merely as master and subject, but as equals, partners, and something neither had fully named but both had recognized in the quiet, powerful moments of trust and courage. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and unyielding, blanketing the palace in silence. Within, the palace seemed to exhale, letting go of centuries of fear, if only for a time. And in that silence, in that fragile moment of victory and understanding, Alara and Corvin understood something they had longed for, something rare and precious in a world of shadows: hope. And though the future remained uncertain, they were ready to face it together. Whatever storms, whatever whispers, whatever shadows might come.